It's 1943, Paris. Champs-Élysées, and the men marching down it in German uniforms aren't prisoners. They're not conscripts. They volunteered. Every single one of them chose to be there. But hold that image. We'll come back to it. By the middle of the war, men from over 20 countries were wearing German uniforms. Danes, Norwegians, Dutchmen, Belgians, Estonians, Bosnian Muslims, Indians, Russians. Historians estimate between 500,000 and 1 million foreign nationals served in German formations, though the line between volunteer and conscript blurred so badly in the later years that even that figure carries uncertainty. So why? Why would a Frenchman fight for Hitler? Why would an Indian join the Wehrmacht? Why would a Soviet soldier volunteer for the army that was burning his country to ash? The answer isn't one reason. It's 5 completely different reasons, and each one reveals something uncomfortable about human nature under pressure. Before we go any further, subscribe if you want history that doesn't flinch. This is that channel. Here's a question. 1943. Your country's been occupied twice, your family's gone. A soldier hands you a rifle and says, "This is your only way to push back." Would you take it? Because the men who said yes are remembered as Waffen-SS volunteers. Tallinn, 1943. The Estonian volunteer battalion Narva holds its swearing-in ceremony. Young men, many of them barely out of their teens, raise their right hands and swear an oath to Adolf Hitler. If you'd asked most of them why they were standing there, the answer wouldn't have been fascism. It would have been June 1941. That's when Soviet authorities conducted a mass deportation across Estonia. Over 10,000 people, intellectuals, military officers, political figures, anyone suspected of disloyalty, loaded onto cattle cars headed for Siberia. The total number of Estonians killed, arrested or deported during that first Soviet year alone, 1940 to 41, eventually reached 60,000. Not just deportations, executions, disappearances, an entire generation of civic life erased in 12 months. When the Germans arrived weeks later, many Estonians saw them at first as the lesser evil. That hope evaporated fast. German occupation brought its own horrors. The systematic mass murder of Estonia's Jewish population was carried out almost entirely, aided by local auxiliary police units, and forced labor was imposed across the country. But for many young Estonian men, even after witnessing what German occupation actually meant, the Soviet threat remained the greater existential danger. By 1943, when the Red Army began pushing west, the math was stark. Fight under German command and preserve some chance of national survival, or wait for the Soviets to return and face a second round. That wasn't ideology. That was arithmetic. The same logic applied across Latvia and Lithuania. Both had experienced identical Soviet occupations. Both produced Waffen-SS volunteer formations that historians still argue about today, because the question of how to categorize men fighting a Soviet occupation under German command doesn't fit neatly into post-war moral categories. Germany exploited this ruthlessly. By 1944, when the military situation became desperate, occupation authorities used Estonian administrative structures to announce a general mobilization. This wasn't volunteering anymore. It was conscription dressed in the language of national defense. A Latvian SS soldier in 1943 was not the same thing as a German SS ideologue from 1933. The uniform was identical. The motivation was entirely different, but survival wasn't the only force pushing men into German uniforms. Some of them came from the other side of the world, and their reasons had nothing to do with deportations or Soviet tanks. 1943. Somewhere in occupied Europe, a unit of soldiers in German uniforms is conducting field exercises. They're Indian. The Free India Legion, officially part of the Wehrmacht, later absorbed into the SS, was composed of Indian nationalists who had concluded that the British Empire was a greater evil than Nazi Germany. Their leader was Subhas Chandra Bose, a former president of the Indian National Congress who had broken with Gandhi over the question of armed resistance. Bose's logic was coldly strategic. Britain's enemy was India's ally. If Germany won, the British Empire would collapse. India would be free. It didn't matter that Nazi racial ideology classified Indians as inferior. It didn't matter that the Legion never saw significant combat and spent most of the war in garrison duty in France. What mattered was that the enemy of your enemy was worth betting on, even when that bet was catastrophically wrong. The Estonians had no real choice. Bose made a calculated gamble. What came next was something darker than either. Men who didn't choose sides at all. They just chose to survive. Of the roughly 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by Germany, approximately 3 million perished from starvation, disease, exposure, and execution. German policy towards Soviet prisoners was, in many cases, deliberately lethal. In those conditions, a German officer's offer to join a collaborationist unit wasn't an ideological proposition. It was a survival calculation with a deadline. General Andrei Vlasov had been a decorated Red Army commander. He'd fought in the defense of Moscow. Then he was captured in 1942 and, over months of German persuasion, agreed to lead the Russian Liberation Army, a force that would eventually number in the hundreds of thousands. His stated argument was that Stalin's regime was as monstrous as Hitler's, and that the only path for Russia was to destroy both. Whether he genuinely believed this or was simply trying to survive captivity remains a question historians still debate. Vlasov's combat troops were only the visible part. Beneath them, hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners survived as Hiwis, Hilfswillige, meaning willing helpers. They drove trucks, cooked food, dug trenches, carried ammunition. By 1943, nearly every German division on the Eastern Front depended on Soviet auxiliaries to function. Vlasov's army fought its last battles in spring 1945. Some of his units actually turned against the Germans in the final weeks, helping Czech partisans liberate Prague. It didn't save him. Soviet forces captured Vlasov after the surrender. He was executed in 1946. So far, every man in this story had something pushing him: occupation, strategic calculation, starvation. Now, meet the men who had none of those excuses, the ones who ran toward it. Brussels, 1941. 800 Walloon men are gathered for a farewell ceremony before shipping out to the Eastern Front. Their leader isn't watching from a podium. He's in the crowd. Not as a general, as a private. His name was Léon de Grelle. He'd built Belgium's fascist Rexist movement on anti-communism, Catholic nationalism, and open admiration for Hitler. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, de Grelle didn't see it as Germany's war. He saw it as Europe's war, a crusade against Bolshevism that he'd been waiting for his entire political life. Nobody deported his family. Nobody handed him a rifle as a choice between service and starvation. He chose this freely, enthusiastically, and without ambiguity. He would fight on the Eastern Front for nearly 4 years, rising from private to SS commanding officer. After the war, he escaped to Spain and lived openly as an unrepentant fascist until 1994. A true believer from start to finish. And he wasn't alone. This is where the story gets uncomfortable in a completely different way. The German propaganda machine run by Goebbels had repackaged Operation Barbarossa as a pan-European event. Not Germany versus Russia. Western civilization versus Bolshevism. Christianity versus atheism. Europe versus the Soviet machine. And it worked. Norway's Quisling movement sent volunteers. Denmark formed the Freikorps Danmark within weeks of the invasion. In the Netherlands, Anton Mussert's Dutch National Socialist movement supplied recruits for the SS soldiers. Heinrich Himmler personally travelled to The Hague in 1942 to oversee the swearing-in of Dutch SS volunteers. Their letters home, their diaries, their post-war testimonies consistently reflect the same conviction. They weren't fighting for Germany. They were fighting for what they believed Germany represented, a Europe purged of communism. These weren't desperate men making impossible choices under occupation. They were ideologically motivated volunteers who looked at the same uniform the Estonian conscripts were handed at gunpoint and put it on with pride. But the strangest true believer of all didn't come from Belgium or the Netherlands. He came from Finland. His name was Lauri Törni, a decorated Finnish war hero who joined the SS specifically to keep fighting the Soviets after Finland's own war wound down. His own country arrested him for treason. He escaped, made his way to America, changed his name to Larry Thorne, and joined the United States Army Special Forces, the Green Berets. He died on a classified mission in Vietnam in 1965. He is the only former SS member buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Same man, 3 flags, and every single choice made perfect sense to him at the time. Same uniform, opposite stories, and Germany was perfectly happy to take them all. Which brings us to the moment the entire ideology finally collapsed under its own weight. November 1943. Neuhammer Training Ground, Silesia. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the SS, the man who had built the entire system on a foundation of racial ideology, is personally inspecting a newly formed division. His soldiers are Bosnian Muslims. The 13th Waffen-SS Mountain Division, known as Handschar, was recruited from Bosnian Muslims who had been targeted by Serbian Chetnik militias during the brutal, multi-sided civil war tearing Yugoslavia apart. For these men, the primary enemy wasn't the Western Allies or the Soviet Union, it was their Serbian neighbours, and Germany was offering weapons, training, and a promise of protection. The SS accommodated Islamic religious practices. Imams served as chaplains. Prayer times were observed. The division's insignia incorporated a scimitar. Himmler, the man who had spent years constructing an ideology of Aryan racial purity, was now recruiting Bosnian Muslims because he needed bodies that would fight in Yugoslavia's mountains. This is the moment the mask came off. The ideology that de Grelle believed in, that the Dutch volunteers swore their lives to Himmler himself, had quietly abandoned it the second it became inconvenient. Handschar was deployed against Tito's communist partisans, a grinding, vicious guerrilla conflict layered with ethnic and religious hatreds that made the Western Front look simple. The division committed atrocities against Serbian and Jewish civilians. It also suffered a mutiny in 1943, driven by broken promises, religious grievances, and resentment of German officers. By almost any strategic measure, Himmler's experiment in multi-ethnic SS recruitment failed. But the fact that it existed at all is the point. The Waffen-SS had been conceived as a racially elite guard formation. By 1943, it was absorbing Bosnian Muslims, Croatian Catholics, Ukrainian nationalists, and Caucasian tribesmen. The institution had become the opposite of what it was designed to be, and that transformation was driven entirely by one thing: desperation, which was always what this was. Here's what the entire foreign volunteer phenomenon tells us about how the war was actually going. Germany didn't recruit foreigners because it wanted to. It recruited them because it had to. Every foreign volunteer in a German uniform was a German veteran who was already gone. By 1943, the Wehrmacht was losing experienced soldiers faster than the Reich could replace them. Total mobilization kept the raw numbers up, but the quality was collapsing. Foreign recruitment was a symptom of strategic failure dressed up as ideological triumph. Goebbels sold it as a pan-European crusade. Himmler sold it as proof that the SS embodied a new European order. In reality, it was a logistical emergency, and every category of volunteer we've looked at, from the true believers to the coerced, was filling a gap Germany could no longer fill itself. The volunteers themselves discovered this truth the hard way. When the war ended, Germany discarded its foreign soldiers without ceremony. What followed for the Soviet and Ukrainian volunteers was a program the Allies called Operation Keelhaul, the forced repatriation of Soviet citizens back to the USSR under the Yalta Agreement. Men were pulled off trains, out of refugee camps, handed over at gunpoint to Soviet authorities. Many didn't survive the handover. Vlasov's men had fought under German command for years and were rewarded with death sentences carried out by the very regime they'd been fighting against. Many Baltic veterans escaped that fate. Because the Western Allies refused to recognize the Soviet annexation of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, thousands of former SS men were able to emigrate to the United States, to Britain, to Canada, where they built new lives and carried their pasts in silence. Remember those Frenchmen we opened with? They were celebrating the second anniversary of the Légion des Volontaires Français in 1943. True believers, ideological volunteers who saw themselves as soldiers in a European crusade, not servants of an occupying power. By 1944, they'd been folded into the Waffen-SS as the 33rd Charlemagne Division. And in the war's final days, between 300 and 400 of them fought in the rubble of Berlin, in the streets around the Reichstag, within blocks of Hitler's bunker. They were among the last soldiers defending a regime that considered them racially inferior. They marched into that war as crusaders. They died in it as expendable fillers for a collapsing army that had long since stopped caring why they showed up. The dictator obsessed with German racial purity spent his final hours being protected by Frenchmen. That's not an ironic footnote. That's the whole story. The system that recruited them had no obligation to protect them once they were no longer useful. It never did. So go back to that question from the beginning. You said you'd take the rifle. Most people would. Now you know what uniform came with it. Is there a meaningful moral difference between a Belgian fascist who volunteered out of conviction in 1941 and an Estonian conscript who had no real choice in 1944? Between an Indian nationalist gambling on the wrong side of history and a Soviet prisoner choosing service over starvation? The same uniform. Completely different stories. Where you draw the line says more about how you think about human agency under pressure than it does about the men themselves. Drop your answer in the comments. Like this video, if this changed how you think about who actually fought in World War II. Subscribe for more of this. We go deep every week.